So today's topic will be centered around taxation. Taxation is one of the most important topics that you will see in your Big Four journey. As an aspiring chartered accountant, what are the specific strategies and techniques that you can implement in order to be successful in a subject like taxation? Hi, my name is Ukhandi Mshungane, chartered accountant and learning strategist. In today's video, we'll be looking exactly at how do you master taxation. We'll be specifically looking at what are some of the misconceptions that you should avoid as you study for a subject like taxation. Then we'll talk about how can you be efficient and why efficiency is important in a subject like tax. Thirdly, we'll look at exam technique, specifically as you do questions and how you can translate that in order to score marks in real life exams and tests. Fourthly, we'll look at topic specific advice, looking at the differences and nuances between some of the topics that we cover from PAT to CGT and how the differences, whether you're looking at individuals and companies, play out. And then lastly, we'll close it out with some general advice and sum up everything we talked about. So let's go straight into it. The first thing that you need to understand about tax is that there are certain misconceptions that you need to ensure that you don't fall trapped to, right? The first misconception is that because tax is such a theory intensive subject, this means that I have to study the for majority of the time. Let me tell you some of the common mistakes that most students make, and even myself when I was transitioning from being a poor student to a good student, is that I spent a lot of my time studying. I found spending days and days on end looking at specific text chapters. I thought that if I understood and performed my notes and memorized, that meant that I was going to be successful. And that was opposite to what the reality was, and it didn't translate into high marks. In fact, I was getting increasingly poor marks, even though I was spending hours studying in large volumes and quantities. So tax is a subject where you need to find the balance between studying but equally doing questions, right? You need to do the questions so that you can understand how the integration works and how it relates to different topics. The second misconception that I had to unlearn is the fact that taxation is easy because of the fact that it's an open book exam. This is far from the truth. In fact, you should ensure that you avoid this misconception at all costs. Taxation might be an open book exam, for example, in your third year and fourth year, right? But that doesn't mean that you shouldn't put in the work to at least understand how the principles come about and why they look the way they do. The reason why that's important is because at the end of the day, they will throw in curveballs and questions or things that you haven't seen before. And if you haven't properly understood the concepts, you can page through the legislation, but it simply won't make any sense to you, and you won't score the marks that you need in order to pass or even excel in your taxation exams. Another misconception that I had to avoid is the notion that because taxation is theory intensive, if I just study the subject in a silo or the topic in a silo, then I'm good to go. That's far from the truth. The topics in taxation are highly interrelated. That links to CGT, links to normal tax. You need to understand how one topic could potentially change your answer if you underpin it with another topic. There are linkage, there is themes within taxation, and you have to look at it in those broad themes if you want to be successful. So how I looked at taxation was that I knew there were three important topics that I always had to know, which was VAT, CGT, and normal tax. Then within normal tax, I understood there were nuances between whether I was looking at an individual and whether I was looking at a company. And then there were certain taxations or tax principles that helped me in terms of how do I collect tax, or things like provisional tax and employee tax. These are not actual tax liability components, but they were collection mechanisms. When you start thinking about your tax topics in those buckets in terms of what is the objective of the topic, what is it trying to achieve? Is it imposing a new tax? Is it a collection mechanism? Is it a recovery mechanism? Then you start being able to piece everything together, and you will then be more successful in taxation, right? Now that we've understood the misconceptions and we now know what to avoid, we also need to equally understand the difficulty about taxation. Let's face it, most of us understand the high volume of theory involved in the subject, but how exactly do I go about learning all this material in such a way that I'm also able to do the questions. This brings us to our second topic, which deals with the importance of efficiency. Now, efficiency is by far one of the most important triggering points if you want to be successful. In fact, when I was making the transition from being a poor student to a good student, one of the key challenges that I had to solve is how am I going to be more efficient? I.e., how could I learn the topic as quickly as possible so that I could spend more time doing the questions and then consulting and embedding the knowledge, right? And that's the important objective that you should be trying to achieve, to learn the subject as quickly and as efficiently as possible. And what I found was that the most important tool at your disposal to do that is attending classes. Now, classes play a pivotal role, especially for a subject like tax. Because there's so much information, you don't want to fall into the trap where you overread textbooks or you look at legislations too much, only to find out either number one, that topic is not examinable in terms of the cycle rules, or number two, that's not exactly how they examine it. Once you go to class, they are able to break it down for you so that you can understand what is the bare essence that I need to pick up from this topic so that you don't fall into that trap. Right. So that's what was important for classes. Equally, what classes were important for was identifying the triggers. Now, in taxation, the biggest risk that you run as a student is reading a scenario and not picking up the issues. And that's why the trigger was important for me. The trigger was the set of circumstances or the events that I had to look out for to know to apply the principles. I found that the majority of my time as a student had to be spent understanding that trigger. When I understood this, then I was able to be more efficient. Instead of trying to memorize calculations and memorize verbiage, which was highly complex, I spend time understanding the trigger. Now, for example, if there's a transaction happening offshore and I'm buying in a foreign denominated currency, I knew that Section 25 will apply. If, for example, I sell a good, I know that I have to consider is there some type of recoupment, or equally in terms of capital gains tax, what type of disposal is this? Now, even though I might not necessarily understand the requirement of how to apply the section, that's what the legislation is designed for. I can flip and go to my flag and actually get it. The important thing is understanding where to go and look. And that's why it was important for me to understand the trigger. But some of you might be asking, but we're still in the junior levels and we don't have an open book exam policy. Even in those instances, guys, when you understand the trigger, it becomes a shortcut for you to be able to learn more efficiently. Because let's face it, you're not going to memorize every single verbatim text of that requirement, but you may recognize the scenario to which that principle applies. So rather grab onto the scenario, grab on to that set of circumstances that you must understand for that principle to apply. And equally, what also helped me here was using techniques like association. Now, association is scientifically proven as a method that can help you understand information better. So instead of memorizing, for example, in VAT, that if I move from 100% to 0%, there's a change in use adjustment. I would rather understand that, oh, I'm actually an owner of a business and I had an asset that I was using 100% in my business for a delivery, for example, to make deliveries or some type of production in my business. But now I've taken that vehicle for my own personal use. So can you see that I've moved from having 100% usage in my business? Now I'm moving from 100% non-usage. That's more, that scenario or that picture is more easy to remember and digest as opposed to numbers that are abstract that don't have any value to you. So try to create mini stories, try to create mini scenarios, even if they're not real, so that you can grasp and relate to the information better as it's exposed to you for the first time in the lecture room. And actually, in the lecture room, what also helped is that I started to study even there. Most students believe that by just attending the class, I'm just attending for the sake of doing it. Don't do that. Understand the why, especially behind the topics. Because what I found is that, especially for a topic like tax, even though it can be abstract at times, it typically tries to solve a problem. Now, most of my effective lecturers, when I was still at school, did a very good job in making me understand the problem statement before they positioned the content. They would typically say, okay, this is the problem. And then my gut instincts would say, I think we should be applying this sort of thing to solve it. and then they would position the content. But even in instances where your lecturer isn't good and they don't position the content well enough so that you understand the problem is trying to solve, your job is still to ask the probing question. Why is this topic important? What problem is it trying to solve? Equally asking questions of why is this topic like this, but the other topic is like that? By drawing these parallels between different topics and themes and understanding the differences, this is how you create the pathways in your brain for association and relatability so that you can better understand and learn the information, right? Another key technique that I talk about that was equally important for a topic like tax is the 24-hour rule. Because I was paying attention in class, asking the right questions, I was getting the right information, which meant I was spending less time after class making my notes. And I was applying a technique called the 24-hour rule. Now, most of you who've watched the channel would know that the 24-hour rule posits that you should attempt to do the quiz, or you should attempt to post read whatever was introduced to you for the first time in the class within 24 hours. When you study the information within 24 hours, it's fresher and therefore you can go through it quicker because you still benefit from having the knowledge still fresh in your mind from what the lecturer was saying. As opposed to if you studied the material a week after it was introduced to you, or 2 weeks, you lose the benefits of attending the class. And that's when you start realizing you're spending hours and hours and even days in some instances learning the same topic. And this is not a problem because you're falling behind, you're not doing the questions, and you won't be successful. So please use the 24-hour rule, especially for a topic like tax, so that you can study as quickly as possible. Another thing is that avoid the temptation to want to read the textbook too much, right? For a topic like tax, what I found is that the lecture notes, more often than not, are sufficient for you to get the material. So I used to look at the lecture notes after class, and then I would quickly flag where I needed to flag again. And that was enough for me because I knew that I was going to benefit more from doing the questions and applying the principles as opposed to spending hours trying to memorize it. So learn quickly, make your notes, flag, and then spend the time embedding the knowledge through questions. Right. And I'm not saying that you shouldn't look at the textbook. The textbook should just merely be a tool. So textbooks like Silk were quite helpful when the lecturer didn't explain the topic well enough or the lecture notes were a bit light. Then I would go to the textbook and try to piece for myself what was the problem statement that this topic was trying to solve. And once I got the link, I stopped reading the textbook and I went back to the lecture notes because I didn't want to spend too much time there where it wasn't warranted, right? Now, once you start being more efficient and then you free up time to do more questions, you'll start seeing an uptick in your knowledge and your integration levels, and then ultimately you'll start being successful. And talk a bit about our memberships. We're excited that based on you, our loyal subscribers, you've told us and we've listened that you need more interaction with us, and hence we're now introducing memberships. Memberships are divided into two elements. The one is what we call Emerging Mind Master. So Emerging Mind Master is for anyone, right? Whether you're an accounting student or not, this is where you simply support our channel. If you like our content, if you like the videos we post out, right, and you want to support us bigger and bigger, you can simply support us and become an Emerging Mind Master, right? Get emojis, badges, and effectively priority in terms of other elements and other benefits. Another way you can become involved in the channel, especially if you are a student and you're studying full-time in accounting and you want help on top of the general advice we give here, you want technical help in accounting, auditing, taxation, or management accounting and finance, we actually have a Mind Master membership where you can get technical videos in all those big four modules. Equally, you have access to a live weekly session with myself that we conduct for members. And equally, this is where we look and dissect and see which is the most difficult subject that the majority of our members are encountering. And then we simply get on a call and we try to unpack that topic as far as possible. And many, many more benefits. So what are you guys waiting for? Join our membership. Now back to the video. But that's one thing. Now that you've mastered how to learn as quickly as possible for a subject like tax, The next thing that you'll have to look at is really now some of the exam technique, especially when you start doing the questions, right? Now, what I found for a topic like tax is that as I did the questions, there were certain things that I had to look out for if I wanted to be successful. The first thing that I realized is that reading time was crucial, especially for a topic or subject like tax. You see, as I've already alluded to earlier on in the video, the danger for tax is you read reams and reams of pages and you fail to identify the issues. And it becomes even more problematic when the required says discuss the total tax considerations. Now, you'll just, at a face value, look at the page and be like, but where are the marks coming from? The problem is that if you're weak with your knowledge, you won't pick up the issues. So what I found was helpful is that every time when I was practicing, I spent and time myself. So what I found is that I actually had to spend the time looking at my reading time with precision so that I could actually jot down and see, what does this sentence mean? What does that sentence mean? By spending the time doing the reading time properly when I was practicing, I was then able to pick up what the main issues were. And this was a very invaluable skill that was helping me, especially when I went to tests and exams. Right. Another technique you can use that especially to perfect the skill of doing reading is that you can spend time with a friend, look at one tutorial each week, and then look at that tutorial and exam technique, make your notes on the side to see what do the individual sentences mean to you, what are the different issues that are being flagged in the scenario. Then spend the time and discuss with that colleague or friend and make sure that you're all on the same page and you're picking up the right issues. That's also another way in order to cultivate the importance of being able to pick up the issue in the reading time. Another technique is that you could again take one tutorial, sit down with a lecturer, sit down with a tutor, and actually see, are you picking up the issues. Very important that you practice picking up the issues in the reading time. Another important element, especially as you answer the theory questions, is be careful in terms of what are they actually asking you. Don't assume that you know the question. Spend the time before you actually draft the question and actually understand what do they want from you, right? Similarly to what we covered in the last video, which is financial accounting, is that we use the IPAC method as well for tax, which stands for issue, principle, application, and conclusion. Now, the issue is the required, right? And you must understand that in text, a couple wording changes make a huge difference in terms of how you answer. There's a difference between the normal tax considerations versus the total tax considerations. Total tax or any tax considerations in general involve considering VAT, CGT, as well as normal tax. You always need to cover these three components if they merely say tax considerations or they're general in terms of what they're asking you. But when they start becoming more specific, like normal tax considerations, you shouldn't cover capital gains tax or VAT in that instance. So understanding what the required wants from you is the first important element. The second important element is that you then need to infuse the principle and the application. If more than anything in a subject like tax, is that they understand that in most instances you have the legislation with you. So you don't really get a lot of marks by listing out what are the different principles, but rather it's listing the principle and immediately applying it to the scenario. That's how you actually score the mark. So always you want to answer the principle and application together. The principle alone does not score you the marks. And here you want to lean on the scenario. For example, if I'm looking at a gross income definition, I know gross income, the first thing I need to talk about is whether I'm a resident or not. But then the mark allocation will guide me, right? And in some instances, it can be very simple that the person is a South African citizen and they're resident. In other instances, I may have to go into a deeper discussion, especially if it's not clear and they're not a South African citizen that residing in South Africa. Then once I've discovered which definition I'm going to use, depending on whether I'm a resident or not, then I look at, is there an amount, for example? And then secondly, has it been received by or accrued to me? And then during the year of assessment, and then other than receipts or accruals of a capital nature. All of these are elements within the gross income definition. At minimum, you can see that there are about 5 marks for each element. In some instances, there might be more judgment. For example, you may have a lot of the points which are being more tilted towards discussing whether this is accrued by or received by. Then you let the scenario guide you based on the information that you're getting, based on the issue that's being examined. But in all instances, you need to immediately apply the principle in order to be able to effectively score the marks. Right. And then, of course, as with everything, you then conclude. It's an easy mark. Conclude based on what you've discussed above. Always remember that so that you can score that easy mark. Right. Another important tool, especially as you do your questions, is that keep a logbook as well as you make mistakes. I found this was increasingly important. There were those small mistakes that I used to make the more questions I did for tax. So I kept a logbook. And then I remembered, oh, by the way, there's a difference between when it's inclusive of that or exclusive of that, right? Maybe I made a mistake, or in some instances, they gave me two variables and I chose the other variable incorrectly. So keep a logbook of the mistakes that you make so that you don't repeat them when exams come about, and you can revise them immediately before. The next element of it is that, as with everything, consult, consult, consult. Sometimes the question or the solution doesn't make sense. So instead of spending hours trying to figure it out, spend time with a lecturer going over it so that they can equally explain to you why the solution is the way it is. Don't take anything for granted. Don't memorize. Always understand, why did I get this question incorrect? That's part of the learning process. Looking at the solution, understanding why you got it wrong, and going back to say, oh, this is why it looks that way, or this is why I got it wrong, is far more effective than memorizing something and not having context, right? So once you now have the right exam technique, the next step is that you need to look at specific topic advice. And I want to cover that, as that is an important, crucial thing as you navigate your tax studies. By far, one of the biggest topics in tax is value added tax. Unfortunately, the VAT legislation or the VAT Act is badly written, in my opinion. So that's why it's important for VAT to come up with a framework in order to look at the specific subsections, so that when you then eventually start flagging, it makes more sense to you. Right. What I found for VAT, there were two broad elements: there's input tax and then there's output tax. And then within each element, it was all about three important components. What is the nature or the type of supply? What is the timing of the supply? And what is the value of the supply? And when you think about VAT in those three constructs, you're more likely to be successful, right? So when I was looking at input VAT, which is can I claim this amount? I looked at, okay, what type of supply is it, right? Am I going to claim 100% of it because it's a fully taxable supply? I'm going to use it to make taxable supplies. Or am I going to claim maybe a general rule of saying, because this asset is used for general purposes, now I need to understand what portion of my general business is for taxable supplies and what portion is non-taxable, and then claim input tax relative to the portion that I'm using to make taxable supplies. Or in some instances, the asset will be used to make wholly exempt supplies. Then in that instance, I can't claim the input VAT. So that's what the type of thinking that you think about when you look at your type of supply. When you look at, for example, something like output VAT, is it a standard rated supply, in which case I levy the full percentage of 15, or is it effectively a zero rated supply, in which case it's still a taxable supply? So remember, a standard rated supply and a zero rated supply are both taxable supplies. And understanding that both values or both supplies are used in order, for example, to understand if I should for that, right? Those are the type of nuances you should think about. Then exempt supplies, if it's a financial service, that's automatically an exempt supply. So having that framework was important for me. And even when I started looking at the other topics, like within VAT, for example, am I going to use an electronic service, right? Is it a second-hand good? Is it property or immovable property? I still think about what is the type of supply, what is the timing of the supply, timing talking to when do I need to pay the VAT, and what is the value of the supply. Value of the supply, in some instances, they could say market value. Think about VAT. If you think about VAT in that sort of framework, then it becomes easier when you start looking at the different sections to say, these are the three things I need to think about, and then this is how I actually focus when I flag. Equally, even when you answer the questions in a test and exam, you're thinking about these three important elements within the VAT legislation. Cool. That was VAT. Another topic that was important was capital gains tax. Now, within capital gains tax, again, this is an extremely large topic, and people who didn't go to class were found wanting because you end up studying everything, and some of the topics are actually not examinable. So this is why it was important to attend classes so I know what is examinable. Let the lecture notes guide you for capital gains tax. Usually, again, the lecture notes are good enough to guide you on what is important and what is examinable, right? And then look at the specific frameworks. Think about the conditions and triggers that will help you be able to understand the different sections within capital gains tax. So broadly speaking, understanding that I aggregate all my capital gains and losses, then I think about the annual exclusion, and then I think about, is there any other capital losses from prior years, my inclusion rates. All of that type of thinking is important for a topic like capital gains tax. But also look at the link. Capital gains tax is an important link with normal tax, and understanding how the two relate is important, because ultimately, if I need to understand proceeds, right, I need to understand, for example, what is the recoupment, right? Recoupment comes from normal tax. So I firstly have to work out my recoupment first. Then I understand, okay, I use that recoupment then to understand the proceeds from a capital gains tax perspective. So there's always a link between the two. Like equally with base cost, I firstly apply my normal tax provisions to understand what is the allowance for an asset. And then once I've understood the allowance from the beginning of the year assessment, I calculate that to the point of from which I dispose of. Then I look at what are my accumulated allowances, and then I take my cost. Then that will give me my base cost that I need for capital gains. The next thing that was important for me, from a topic perspective, is understanding normal tax, and then within normal tax, the differences between an individual and the differences between companies. And I'll try as best as I can to give you some of the advice within the topics, right? For me, for normal tax, what was important was definitely special inclusions. Very important. Special inclusions are, if you identify in a scenario, it's an easy mark to earn. So look at things like special inclusion. Whether is it a fringe benefit, is it a service that you're rendering, is it a restraint of trade, which is section C, is it a lump sum benefit that you're getting, which is paragraph D, right? All those things that I'm talking about are important. Then equally your annual exclusions, easy marks again. And especially if it's an open type of book, you flag it correctly to say, okay, I need to go to section 10 for my annual exclusions. And then there's typically a link between I first included in gross income, and then potentially I look at, is there an exclusion in terms of section 10. Then again, special deductions are equally important, especially for individuals, right? Things like pensions, things like contributions to medical aids, and all of those type of elements. Rebates were equally important, right? So is this a medical aid rebate? Is it a normal tax rebate, right? That type of thinking is important. Other topics were important within individuals is, how do I collect the tax? That was employees tax, so understanding employees tax and provisional tax. So all of these topics are important, and you need to think about them when considering individuals. Then from a company perspective, I found that there was a lot of focus on capital allowances, equally because usually people didn't have a lot of assets, but companies did have a lot of assets. So therefore things like allowances on buildings, allowances on movable assets became important for companies' tax. Equally, in some instances, you might have these special deductions as well, especially for companies that are not available to people. Like I might have a broad employment plan, and what does that mean? And then I can get specific deductions if I pay certain bonuses to my employees. Think about things like that, right? Other elements within companies, knowing that what is the structure for a company, right? So these are all specific topic examples that I think you should consider as you study your tax and you go through and navigate through your studies. So what are other general sort of advice that I can give you in order to do well in a topic like tax? One important thing is that I would advise you is that try to flag correctly. Now, there are different schools of thought as to how do you go about flagging. I flagged via section numbers. It was easier to be able to find information in the ledger. If I used words, I had to spend time reading the specific legislation or reading the specific flag, which wasted time. But if I knew the sections, and that's also presented to us. But It's all up to you. What's easy for you, I'd recommend that you apply that. For me, section numbers were crucial because, first of all, they didn't cram my flags, so they were easier to find. And also, I found that it linked to how I would score marks in a test and exam. If I would link to what section it is, that would give me a mark as opposed to just simply stating it. Right? Equally, what helps is that I had a color scheme that I used in order to highlight. So my general provisos were typically in one color, and my exceptions were typically another, which was red. It's very important, guys, that you understand how to read legislation. And as you highlight the legislation, sometimes you might forget a requirement or forget how to apply something. But if you've highlighted correctly, and don't over highlight, this is important, right? Pick keywords or key terms. So before you start highlighting, my advice would be just skim through the text and understand what is it trying to achieve, and then highlight those keywords that underpin the principle, or those keywords that you may have to look out for in a scenario when you're doing a question. And then have a different color for the provisos, because in tax sometimes they have a general requirement, but that general requirement is nullified if the exceptions to the rule apply. So, like for example, when I looked at fringe benefits, I knew that these are the general requirements. And when I was studying fringe benefits for individuals, I spent the time to say, okay, this is the type of award it is if it's a vehicle, if it's a vehicle award, is it a long service award, right? But I knew that in the fringe benefit section, they would have the general requirement of what is a fringe benefit or the different types of fringe benefit. But equally, they would also have no value items. So this is where it is a fringe benefit, but there's no value assigned to it because it meets one of those requirements. So I had a different color for all my no values versus what my general provisos are. So use color schemes in that way in order to be able to navigate the information easily as you study. All right. The next thing that I would advise you to do, especially for a topic again like tax, is that be active in your tutorial sessions. Right. So by being active in your tutorial sessions, this means that you need to actively ask questions. Right. When you ask questions, this is when you learn. But equally, try to participate and see if whether your understanding is correct. So I used to participate heavily in tax classes because that was an equally another way to embed knowledge. Because tax is such a theory intensive subject, the important thing is to try to digest the information and embed it so that it's understandable to you. So the more questions you do, the more you participate and teach other people and participate in these sort of tutorials, you're actually embedding the knowledge within you. So try to participate. And when you have those unseens, if you're lucky enough to have tutorials and you have those unseen questions, take those unseen questions very seriously, right? Instead of taking them as sort of like, I just need to do them, try to see them as like a practice test and do it properly so that you can test what you know. As well as concept tests. I know that when I was studying, we used to have concept tests. Now, where people used to study for concept tests, for me, concept tests were more to test my knowledge because I kept up to date with my work and my text and text work, because I was using efficient methods and equally I was doing all the questions. It meant that I was using the concept test as a way to practice, right? So use those concept tests to test your knowledge rather than to learn for the sake of doing well in them. And next thing that I also advise you to do. Right, guys, this brings us to the end of the video. Hopefully this was helpful and you now have a better skills and you are better equipped to be able to tackle taxation. Let's chat in the comment section. How was the video? Was it helpful? Was it of value? And if I did miss anything, feel free to ask questions in the comment section. Then I can answer your question in terms of anything you have in relation to this topic. Remember to hit the thumbs up, share the video with as many people as possible, and remember that I believe in you. You can do it. Until we meet again. Let's take a quick detour